As I continue this summer's series of sermons on new mitzvot for our times, I think an explanation is in order as to why, in the midst of what have been and continue to be some very troubling times for Israel, I've not chosen during this period to scrap my original plan of this sermon series and instead share perspectives about the horrific situation that has threatened our family, our brothers and sisters in Israel, and that has resulted in such destruction of human life on both sides. And the answer is rather simple. No one, not a single one of us, has a corner on some truth about the situation. At times such as these, and may they diminish speedily, the best we can do is follow the news, link our hearts to those who desperately need our support, keep our minds open, and above all, avoid despair, and resist looking at things as all black or all white with no room for gray in the middle. And yet we can pray, because ultimately it may very well be that it is through our prayers and through the prayers of others that we express our deepest held values and deepest held hopes. Over the past few weeks, since the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has heightened, I've been inserting a number of prayers into our Shabbat service, just as I have done tonight. Because for me, the recitation of such prayers is a way of maintaining my own humanity in the midst of situations that sorely challenge and test it. And it is to proclaim unequivocally my belief that peace can prevail if we somehow sift through the piles of rhetoric and restrain ourselves from resorting to and embracing cliches and stereotypes that can only thwart the peace process. And having said that, let me now turn to this, the next to the last in this series of sermons on new mitzvot for our times. And over the last few weeks, I've pointed out more than once that the traditional enumeration of mitzvot, generally translated as commandments in the Torah, divides them into two categories, the do's and the don'ts. The do's, namely those positive commandments, and the don'ts, those negative commandments. And I've pointed out more than once that the number of don'ts, the number of negative commandments, 365 of them, things that one should not do, is far greater than the number of positive commandments, 248, the things that one ought to do or should do. The mitzvot, the commandments, are essentially there to guide our behavior, and more often than not, that guidance has to be in the form of restrictions and limitations. But there's another way of looking at the whole system of mitzvot, the whole system of laws. They can be overriding principles, or they can be quite specific. It's often the case that we have no problem with the broad principles, but we do have problems, we do have trouble when the laws or the application of those laws becomes quite specific. I've often shared the story of the country church that was in search of a new pastor. And a young clergy person, fresh out of seminary, was called to come to that country parish. And unsure of the manners of people in that rural community, that country community, this newly minted pastor, full of enthusiasm, preached his first sermon on what he thought would be a rather safe subject. the Ten Commandments. And the sermon was extremely well received. The folks in that church complimented him for a splendid debut in the pulpit. So the next week, feeling quite confident of himself and thinking that he was on a roll here in this new congregation, the minister decided, well, I'll speak on the Ten Commandments again, but this time I'll narrow it down. I'll speak about the commandment, thou shalt not steal. And again, the country church congregation was lavish in its compliments to the young preacher, and even more bolstered by that reception that he received from the members of that country church. He decided, well, I'm on a roll. Next week I'll continue the thread, but this time it turned out that the sermon was a total bust. No one talked to the preacher on their way out of church. They barely shook the pastor's hands. There was no eye contact as they shuffled out the door. The congregation that for the past couple of weeks had been so laudatory was now indignant. And why? Because this week the pastor's sermon was on, thou shalt not steal chickens. Well, I tell this story because it's one thing to think of mitzvot in general terms. It's another thing to apply those general principles to specifics, to move from the abstract to the very concrete. It's one thing for us to accept as a guideline for our day-to-day actions the commandment not to steal, but if we're farmers, it's maybe not that easy to accept the more specific restriction on not stealing chickens. So tonight, let me ask you to think about something quite specific. Though I don't have any way of proving it, my guess is that the most blatant violators of the laws concerning the stealing of what is generally called intellectual property are, you may be surprised, non-profit organizations and institutions, and among them, the most egregious violators are synagogues and churches. There are laws, for example, that restrict us from copying materials, whether it's to save money or for convenience, but it goes on all the time, and not just in some other temple or church, it goes on right here. And yes, I know quite well the usual explanations or excuses. I know them well because I've often offered them, and I've offered them way too many times. Things like, look, we can't buy the books for each of our students because they cost too much and we don't have any extra money, so let's just buy one copy and we'll Xerox the rest. Or, so what's the big deal about copying a sheaf of music? Or, well, we'll just lift 20 or 30 pages from a prayer book and duplicate them and not indicate anywhere that this is not our work, but it's been lifted lock, stock, and barrel from a published book. There are lots of examples that I could give. Yes, there are some materials that are in what we call the public domain, that we have permission by virtue of their being in the public domain to copy freely, but there are lots of others that are not. Among the many marvels of the technological age in which we live has been the development of the copying machine, something that can be a blessing, but it can also be a curse. It enables us to really skirt around the law. And we often justify our behavior by offering the rationalizations like, well, who are we hurting? Or, you know it's for a good cause, that should make it okay. Our Jewish tradition long ago addressed similar situations when in Jewish law it insisted that if one appropriates the intellectual property of another, one is obligated to give credit to that source. There's a phrase we use in our tradition, b'shem amro, and that means that one is obligated, duty-bound by Jewish law, to make clear that what he or she is saying or writing may have been partially or fully taken from the work of another. It is what we normally think of as plagiarism. Jewish law is insistent that one must give credit if one is taking someone else's words, that one cannot pass them off as their own. Now, some of you, I'm sure, have had the experience of going into a place like FedEx Kinko's and asking them to copy a couple pages from a book or to copy some photos that were taken by a professional photographer because you don't want to pay the photographer that expensive price for a number of copies. The pictures, we'll just copy them. They'll come out just as well. Or some other copyrighted item, and you've been refused because making such copies is illegal. And those who operate those copying shops become accomplices to an illegal act. It's a violation of the copyright law that goes back to the very beginnings of our nation when the Constitution was adopted. I was interested in an article that recently appeared in a journal that says that copyrights exist so that a person who creates a new work, such as a song, a picture, a story, can derive some profit from it. And this is based, the article says, on a provision in the Constitution that gives Congress the power to encourage the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. In Jewish law, that goes back way, way before the Constitution, there are similar protections of intellectual property. Rabbinic law says that one must not deprive an other of their just due. It commands us to give credit where credit is due. The incredible development of machines that make it so easy and relatively inexpensive and convenient, yes, to copy with amazingly high resolution materials that others have created and to which others are entitled to gain fair compensation and profit, it requires us, I believe, to give some serious consideration to our own behavior when it comes to infringing on the copyright protection of others. And of all the institutions that should see this and treat this as a mitzvah, as something that demands self-discipline, it ought to be the synagogues and the churches. But it's not just the synagogue and church. Each of us in our private lives are constantly tempted to disregard those restrictions imposed by law and to rationalize our behavior with, who cares? Or so what? Who am I really hurting? Or just one copy. Well, you know what the excuses are, and I certainly do because I've used them and continue to use them way too often. Among the new mitzvot for our time, I would add such commandments as, you are not allowed to steal the intellectual property of another, or you must acknowledge when something is not your own creation and give credit where credit is due. Or you must not deprive an other of his or her rightful profit by copying their work. Now, there are, by the way, other ramifications, and I think of them particularly in the Jewish setting. What, for example, enables Jewish scholars to continue their work? What enables Jewish musicians to continue their work? It's to be able to make a living from what they do. And part of that comes from being able to sell the product of their creative genius. And when we circumvent the law and we take advantage and don't give them their just due, we are inflicting terrible harm upon them. It just so happens that in this week's portion of the Torah, we find the restatement of the Ten Commandments. And yes, it's very easy to affirm the importance of those 10 mitzvot, or commandments. And in those 10 utterances, we find more negative than positive commandments, more restrictive commandments, like don't take that which belongs to another, don't steal. That none of us have any problem affirming that. Every one of us would agree, well, you mustn't steal. For after all, stealing is wrong. But every now and then, we're confronted with making a choice as to whether to steal chickens or not. And that becomes more problematic. Mitzvot are, as I've said during this series of sermons, opportunities for holiness. And as such, they call on us, not just call on us, they require us to impose some discipline on ourselves, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, to prevent us from doing something that is injurious to others or to ourselves. It may seem rather inconsequential, and maybe it'll seem somewhat naive, but today I placed a sign on the area of our temple's administrative offices where our copier is located to remind myself and others to follow the law that prohibits the infringement of copyright laws. Frankly, I don't know whether I'm going to be very good at heeding the warning all the time. And I don't know whether others will heed it some of the time or all of the time, because that's the nature of mitzvot. Whether we succeed all of the time in disciplining ourselves is questionable. That we can do better at it than we have been doing is clear. It's certainly well worth giving it a try.